It was supposed to be their 10th anniversary, a decade of love, partnership, and promises kept. Julia had planned everything weeks in advance. She reserved a table at Maison Lumière, the French bistro where she and Daniel had shared their first kiss. She even managed to get the same table by the window, the one that overlooked the city skyline, just as it did on that rainy April evening 10 years ago. She wore the same deep blue silk dress she'd kept all these years, the one that made Daniel say she looked like a vision that night. Her hair was done in soft waves, just the way he liked it, and she'd even spritzed on the expensive perfume he bought her on their 5th anniversary. She lit the candles at home, set out a bottle of Pinot Noir, and waited. At 5:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit up the screen. "Hey, Jules," he said, his voice low and rushed. "I'm so sorry, babe. Something urgent came up at the firm. One of our investors just landed and I have to meet him. It's Big Julia. I wouldn't skip tonight if it weren't. Rain check. Rain check." She stared at the flickering candles on the table, then at the chilled wine, the perfectly set plates. She didn't speak for a second. Then, as if trained to accept disappointment with grace, she replied, "Of course, I understand. Go impress the investor." "You're the best," he said, already fading out of the call. "I owe you big time. Love you." The line went dead. Julia sat down on the edge of the couch, her heart heavier than she expected. The silence of the apartment was deafening, broken only by the low hum of traffic outside. She poured herself a glass of the Pinot Noir and took a slow sip. It tasted bitter. 2 hours later, she was curled up on the couch, half watching a romantic comedy on TV and half scrolling through her phone. There was a notification from her banking app, a receipt Daniel had emailed to their shared account for reimbursement. She opened it absent-mindedly. Her thumb froze mid-scroll. Hotel Magnifique, executive suite. One night, $2.73 Her eyes moved down to the timestamp, 6:03 p.m., the night of their anniversary. She blinked, then reread it. Her breath caught. Why would Daniel be at a hotel, an expensive luxury one, on the night he said he had an emergency meeting with an investor? Her chest tightened. A dozen rationalizations fought for attention. Maybe it was a client expense. Maybe he didn't want to drive home after drinks. Maybe it was booked for someone else. But none of those excuses made sense when she saw the name on the reservation, Daniel Martinez. The next morning, she went about her usual routine in silence. Daniel had come home around 9 a.m. freshly showered, smelling faintly of mint and cologne. He kissed her cheek and said he had a long night of negotiations, but that they had secured the deal. He looked tired but content. She smiled and nodded, suppressing the questions that burned in her throat. Later, when he stepped out for a quick gym session, Julia went to the laundry basket and quietly checked the pockets of the blazer he had worn the night before. And there it was, the hard copy of the receipt, folded neatly. She unfolded it and held it in her hands like it was a piece of broken glass. The suite included a late checkout champagne service and dinner for two. Dinner for two. She put the receipt back exactly where she found it. For the next few days, Julia functioned like a ghost. She went to work, led meetings, smiled politely at clients, but her mind was adrift. Every word Daniel said felt like a performance. Every embrace felt slightly staged. She began to take notice of things she once overlooked, the way he flinched when she mentioned plans weeks in advance, the unfamiliar cologne she sometimes smelled on his shirts, the way he laughed at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. She wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. She wanted the truth, not guesses, not suspicions, but something undeniable. That Sunday, Daniel said he had to fly to San Diego for a conference. She nodded, kissed him goodbye at the door, and watched from the window as his Uber drove off. Then she called the Hotel Magnifique. "Hello, I'm calling to inquire about a stay my husband may have had at your hotel last Thursday," she said calmly, giving them the details. "I just need to confirm the reservation." "Yes, ma'am," the receptionist replied. "Mr. Daniel Martinez checked in at 6:03 p.m. and checked out at 11:40 a.m. the next day. Was anyone else listed on the room?" There was a pause. "I'm sorry, but we can't disclose guest names due to privacy policy." "I understand," Julia replied, her voice even. "Can you tell me if the champagne and dinner service was used?" "Yes, ma'am. Dinner for two was served in the room at 8 p.m. Julia ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the marble counter like it might rearrange itself into some sort of answer. Her throat tightened, but no tears came. Instead, there was a quiet, cold resolve settling in. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to beg. She needed more. She needed everything to be in the light before she acted. She looked around the apartment they had built together. Every framed photo on the wall, every memento, every trinket from vacations, suddenly it all felt like part of a set, a carefully constructed stage for a play she didn't audition for. Her anniversary wasn't forgotten. It was replaced. And that truth, sharp as glass, had only just begun to cut. But Julia Martinez wasn't going to bleed quietly. Not anymore. Julia didn't sleep that night. She laid in bed beside Daniel, his breathing deep and steady, utterly unaware of the storm gathering inches from him. She stared at the ceiling, her mind working like a machine with no off switch. Every conversation, every late night, every trip, every canceled plan, they all clicked into place like pieces of a bitter puzzle. The hotel receipt had only confirmed what her gut had whispered for months. She spent the next morning pretending. She brewed his favorite coffee, smiled when he mentioned a business brunch, kissed him goodbye, like always. But inside, she was unraveling everything: their shared accounts, the credit card charges, the call logs on their family plan. What she found didn't shock her anymore. Multiple charges at restaurants he never mentioned, Uber rides that ended at upscale neighborhoods, flowers sent to a mysterious address. Then there were the photos. Julia wasn't proud of herself, but she needed clarity. She hired a discreet private investigator, a woman named Ray, who specialized in domestic cases. Ray didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, took the materials Julia provided, and promised to return in a week with everything Julia needed to know. In the days that followed, Julia threw herself into work. Her designs took on a sharper edge, moody palettes, bolder contrasts, less softness. Her co-workers complimented her focus, not knowing it was fueled by rage distilled into control. She couldn't cry. Not yet. She couldn't collapse. Not until she saw it with her own eyes. Daniel, of course, remained his usual charming self. He brought her takeout one night, kissed her neck while she was cooking, even suggested a weekend getaway to make up for missing our anniversary. Julia smiled and said that sounded lovely. Inside, she cataloged every gesture, every lie, every carefully rehearsed performance. The man she had married had either disappeared somewhere along the way or, worse, had never really been there to begin with. A week later, Ray called. "Can we meet in person? I have everything." They met at a quiet cafe on the east side of town. Julia sat by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, her heart thudding like a drum. Ray arrived exactly on time, a slim folder in hand. She slid it across the table. "Do you want me to walk you through it, or do you want to read alone?" Julia looked down at the folder. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. There were photos, Daniel holding hands with a younger woman outside a wine bar, kissing her cheek, as they entered a boutique hotel sitting close at a rooftop restaurant. There were time-stamped surveillance stills, receipts, a transcript of overheard conversation confirming the woman's name was Amber. She was 28, worked in marketing, single, or at least she thought she was. Julia closed the folder. "Thank you," she said softly. Ray studied her carefully. "Do you want to talk about next steps?" Julia shook her head. "Not yet, but I will." That night she cooked dinner. Her mother's beef stew recipe slow-simmered, served with warm bread. Daniel walked in, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Smells amazing. What's the occasion? Just wanted a cozy night." They ate together. Julia asked about his day, listened to him complain about meetings, and even laughed when he recounted a funny client story. Her eyes never left him. She watched his every move with the curiosity of someone studying a stranger who wore a familiar face. When dinner was done, she poured 2 glasses of red wine. "Let's sit outside for a bit." They stepped onto the balcony, the city glowing softly beneath them. Daniel leaned on the railing, sipping his wine. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking we should go somewhere, just the 2 of us, no work, no phones." "That sounds perfect," Julia replied. "Italy, maybe you've always wanted to see Tuscany." "I have." There was a pause. Then softly she asked, "Are you happy, Daniel, with me?" He turned to her, surprised. "Of course I am. Why would you even ask that?" Julia looked at him for a long moment. "Sometimes I wonder if we're both just playing roles now, going through motions because it's easier than telling the truth." He chuckled awkwardly. "Jules, you're overthinking again. You always do this when work gets stressful." She nodded, then sipped her wine. "Maybe." They stood in silence for a while. Daniel talked about a new client. Julia let his words wash over her, each one drifting farther from the man she once loved. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Later that night, she stared at the folder again. She knew she couldn't keep this up, but she also knew she didn't want a screaming match, a dramatic exit, or tears that wouldn't fix anything. She wanted dignity. She wanted control. And she wanted Daniel to feel what she had felt, shock, disbelief, and the hollow ache of betrayal. So she began to plan. First, she secured a new place, a small but beautiful loft near the design studio where she worked. She paid the deposit in cash. She started moving little things first, closed documents, her personal keepsakes, all while Daniel thought she was staying late at work. Next, she met with a lawyer, not to file anything yet, but to understand her options. Financially, emotionally, logistically, she didn't want revenge. She wanted freedom and clarity. She also met with a therapist, not because she was broken, but because she refused to let this betrayal define her. They talked about grief, identity, and what it meant to rebuild a self that had been tethered to someone else for so long. And through it all, Julia smiled. She smiled at work, at friends, even at Daniel. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. One night, 2 weeks later, Daniel came home early with tickets to a play. "Surprise date night," he said, beaming. Julia smiled back. "I have a surprise, too." She handed him a small wrapped box. Inside was a key. "What's this?" he asked, puzzled. "It's the key to my new apartment," she said calmly. "I'll be moving out by the end of the week." He laughed. thinking it was a joke. Then he saw her eyes. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Julia, wait, we can talk about this. What's going on?" She stood tall. "What's going on is that I gave everything to this marriage. My time, my heart, my loyalty. And in return, I got lies, hotel receipts, and another woman. I know about Amber. I know everything." Daniel froze. His mouth opened, then closed. "You don't have to say anything," Julia continued. "This isn't a fight. It's a decision, one I've already made." He tried to speak, but she held up her hand. "Please don't insult me with apologies now. Just let me go." He stood there in stunned silence as she walked past him, each step more certain than the last. That night, Julia didn't cry. She packed a suitcase, made herself tea, and watched the city lights from the bedroom window. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. She had chosen herself, and this time she wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. Moving into the loft was nothing like Julia expected. It wasn't glamorous or freeing, not at first. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that echoed in the bones, stretching out across the whitewashed brick walls, like it had been waiting for her. Her new place smelled of fresh paint and lemon cleaner. The windows were huge, but the light that came in felt unfamiliar. It was a blank slate, and blank slates can be both beautiful and terrifying. She unpacked slowly, her clothes books, sketch pads, and art supplies. She hung up a few framed prints she'd always loved, but Daniel had called cluttered. For the first time in years, Julia listened to her own taste, her own rhythm. She played soft jazz while she unpacked and made tea in the mornings. At night, she sat on the floor with a blanket and stared at the ceiling, not crying, not smiling, just feeling. The first few days she didn't tell anyone, not her co-workers, not her friends, not even her sister. She needed space from questions, from pity, from opinions, but mostly she needed to figure out who she was when she wasn't Daniel's wife. On the third day, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Daniel, please, can we talk? I don't understand why you're doing this." She stared at the screen. Not a word about Amber, not even an attempt at honesty. Just confusion wrapped in manipulation. She muted the conversation and put the phone face down on the table. She started therapy sessions twice a week. Her therapist, Dr. Sims, was a gentle woman with sharp eyes and a quiet voice. She asked questions that weren't always easy to answer. "What did you lose in this marriage?" Julia thought for a moment. "Myself." "What did you gain?" Another long pause, then softly, "Endurance." Dr. Sims smiled gently. "Let's build something from that." Outside therapy, Julia poured herself into design. Her new client wanted a complete overhaul of a heritage apartment. Instead of soft pastels and airy neutrals, Julia proposed rich textures, dark greens, walnut accents. She presented bold concepts with calm certainty, and her clients listened. She was no longer second-guessing her voice. One evening, after finalizing the cabinet finishes, she sat alone on the balcony of her loft, sipping a glass of wine, legs tucked beneath her. The city below was alive but distant, like a movie she didn't have to play in anymore. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. "Daniel, I messed up. I know that now. It didn't mean anything. I want to fix this. Please let me." She didn't respond. The next day, Amber messaged her on Instagram. "Amber, I didn't know he was married. I swear, he said you two were separated. I'm sorry." Julia stared at the message. She believed Amber. It didn't make things better, but it confirmed something vital. Daniel hadn't just cheated. He'd lied about her very existence. That night, Julia pulled out one of her old sketchbooks. She flipped past old concepts, wedding reception layouts, cozy guest room designs. Then she found a page she didn't remember drawing. A woman sitting alone at a table set for two. One chair was empty. The woman was pouring wine into a glass already full. Julia traced the lines with her finger. She knew that woman. 2 weeks later, Julia met her sister Mara for lunch. "So you gonna tell me what the hell happened?" Mara asked, stirring her iced tea like it had done something wrong. Julia smiled faintly. "I left him." Mara blinked. "You what?" "I moved out." "Julia, are you okay?" "What did he do?" Julia looked down at her hands, then back at her sister. "He lied a lot, and there was someone else." Mara swore under her breath. "I always hated how perfect he acted. Too polished, too charming." Julia nodded. "I didn't see it for so long. Or maybe I didn't want to." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mara reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're brave, and you're not alone." After lunch, Julia walked through the city, letting the wind play with her hair. She stopped at a bookstore and bought 3 novels she'd been meaning to read. At a boutique nearby, she bought herself a deep green scarf, the kind Daniel would have said clashed with her skin. She wore it out of the store, proud and defiant. That evening, her friend Aisha called. "Girl, I heard through the grapevine. You want to talk about it?" Julia laughed. For the first time, it felt real. "Maybe I do." They talked for 2 hours, laughed, vented, even cried a little. Aisha told her about her own divorce years ago and how long it took to remember who she was. "It doesn't happen all at once," she said. "It comes back to you in pieces, like sunlight through clouds." Julia stood at the window after the call, watching the city. She wasn't healed, but she was beginning. One morning, she woke up without reaching for her phone. She made breakfast, took a long shower, and decided to visit her parents. She hadn't told them yet, not out of shame, but because she needed to tell it in her own way, on her own terms. Her mother opened the door and gasped. "Julia, why didn't you tell us you were coming?" "I needed to see home." They talked in the kitchen over coffee. Her father said nothing for a while, just listened. Then he nodded slowly. "I always wanted you to be with someone who made you feel seen." Julia looked at him surprised. "You never said anything." "You looked happy, and sometimes that's enough, until it isn't." She hugged him tight. By the end of the 3rd week in her new place, Julia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Stillness, not the aching silence of abandonment, but the soft, steady quiet of selfhood. No performance, no waiting, just her in her space with her breath. Daniel sent flowers one last time, white roses, a note that said, "I'll wait." She donated them to the women's shelter down the street. Julia wasn't waiting anymore. She was becoming, and that was more than enough. Julia had always believed in closure. She thought it was something you could arrive at, like a final stop on a long train ride. You gather the facts, make the decision, and then move on. But the weeks that followed her decision to leave, Daniel taught her otherwise. Closure, she learned, wasn't a door you walked through. It was a series of small, deliberate acts. It was found in the way she folded her laundry while humming to a playlist she hadn't touched in years, or the way she chose to let her phone ring when Daniel called for the 4th time that week, and she simply stared at the screen unbothered. Some days were harder than others. There were moments she still reached across the bed in the middle of the night expecting his familiar shape. Sometimes she opened the fridge and instinctively pulled out ingredients for his favorite meal before catching herself. But the grief was gentler now. It no longer tore through her. It drifted in like fog, settled for a while, then left. Her therapist, Dr. Sims, encouraged her to write. Don't just process it in your mind. Move it through your hands. Give it a place to live. That's not inside you, she said. So Julia began journaling. She wrote about her fears, her past, her guilt, and the dreams she used to have before she became someone's wife. She wrote about the girl who once wanted to open her own design firm, who used to spend weekends creating mood boards for fun, who believed love didn't require her to shrink. And slowly, that girl started coming back. One Saturday afternoon, Julia visited the local community center where Aisha volunteered. They were hosting an event for young women entering the design industry, workshops, mentorships, portfolio reviews. Julia hadn't planned to speak, just observe. But when the host asked if she'd share a few words, she found herself standing in front of a room of bright, eager faces. I used to think the most important thing in a partnership was harmony, she said. But sometimes harmony means silence. Sometimes it means giving up your own voice to keep the peace. I learned that it's better to be heard and messy than silent and fading. The room was still, and then applause. Afterward, a girl named Marisol approached her, eyes wide with admiration. Your story made me want to start over. I thought I had to stay in something just because I chose it once, but maybe I can choose again. Julia hugged her. You absolutely can. That evening, walking home under a sky painted in gold and lavender, Julia realized she wasn't just healing, she was becoming someone new, someone bolder, someone braver. The next week, her boss offered her a lead role on the firm's newest project, redesigning the city's historic theater. It was a dream assignment. She accepted without hesitation. Daniel would have tried to talk her out of it, too much pressure, too many late nights. But Julia didn't need permission anymore. She threw herself into the work, researching vintage architecture, sketching, modern flourishes, meeting with curators and lighting engineers. Every detail mattered. It was exhausting but exhilarating. During one of the late-night design sessions, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Unknown. Julia, it's Amber. I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't lash out at me. You didn't humiliate me. I didn't deserve your grace, but I'll never forget it. I left him. And I'm finding myself too. Julia stared at the message, then typed back, Julia. We all make mistakes. What we do next is what matters. I wish you healing. She put down the phone and returned to her sketches, the lines on the page flowing more freely now. The past no longer held her pen. By the third month in her loft, the space felt like home. The walls had artwork she chose, the shelves had books she loved, and the fridge held only what she actually liked. She hosted a dinner for a few close friends, her first gathering since the separation. They toasted to beginnings, laughed over wine, and danced barefoot to old R&B hits. Someone put on a slow song, and for a moment Julia hesitated. Then she let herself sway to the music, eyes closed, arms wrapped around herself. It was a different kind of dance, a dance of arrival. Later that night, she stood on her balcony barefoot, holding a cup of chamomile tea. The wind played with the hem of her robe. Below, the city pulsed with quiet life. She wasn't waiting for Daniel anymore. She wasn't haunted by what he took or what she lost. She was here, now. The next morning, she woke to an email from Daniel. The subject line read, "Final try." The message was long. Regret, admissions, rationalizations. He said he missed her. He was starting therapy. He wanted to meet one last time. He said he understood if she never responded, but he'd always wonder what could have been. She stared at the email for a long time. Then she closed her laptop, stood up, and went to water her plants. That was her answer, because healing isn't always loud. It doesn't always end in a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's watering your plants instead of reopening old wounds. 2 weeks later, Julia stood in the theater's grand hall, hard hat on blueprints in hand. Construction had begun. Her team followed her lead. She gave direction with clarity, offering ideas with conviction. The project manager, a kind man named Ellis, watched her with admiration. "You've got vision," he said. Julia smiled. "I'm just finally trusting it." She didn't know what the next year would bring. Maybe love, maybe solitude, maybe something in between. But she knew whatever came next, it would be on her terms. That night she began a new journal. On the first page she wrote, "I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to become after." And with that she turned the page and kept writing. Spring came early that year with soft breezes and magnolia blossoms painting the sidewalks in white and blush. Julia felt it in her bones, the shift, the awakening. Everything in her life seemed to be cracking open gently, like a seed finally breaking through the soil after being buried in darkness for too long. Her mornings now started with sunlight spilling across the loft, the smell of coffee brewing, and a playlist of soulful piano ballads. She had found a rhythm. Not the kind that marched to anyone else's expectations, but one that pulsed from within her own chest. Her work on the theater project had become more than just a job, it was her resurrection. She poured herself into the details, custom banisters inspired by 1920s architecture, velvet seating swatches, and midnight blue chandeliers that mimicked falling stars. Every element whispered the story of transformation. Ellis, the project manager, had become a trusted collaborator. They shared long work days, takeaway dinners in the scaffolding shadows, and the kind of silence that only came when two people were completely focused but at peace in each other's presence. He was never intrusive, never pushy, just steady. Julia found herself looking forward to his insights and the easy way he laughed with his whole face. One day, as they reviewed lighting plans side by side, their hands brushed. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to interpret it either. It just was. That night, Julia sat on her balcony with a glass of wine watching the sky shift from pink to navy. She thought of Daniel only briefly and not with anger or longing, but with a curious kind of detachment. Like remembering a book you once loved but outgrew. She pulled her sketch pad onto her lap and began drawing a space she dreamed of, a studio with arched windows, tall ceilings, and wooden floors that creaked. A space where women could create, heal, and rebuild. By the time she finished, the moon was high. She wrote one word beneath the sketch sanctuary. The idea grew like ivy. She began researching grants, locations, and similar nonprofits across the country. Could she build something that supported women stepping out of grief, abuse, or betrayal? Could she teach design as a form of therapy and empowerment? 2 weeks later, she stood in front of a decommissioned library on the east side of town. The paint was chipped, windows dusty, but the bones were strong. She could see its sunlight streaming through a new pain's rooms filled with laughter and stories, a place where broken things became beautiful again. Julia snapped photos, took notes, and set a meeting with the city's redevelopment office. "You're serious about this," Ellis said one evening as she showed him her plans spread out across the theater's stage. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied. "It's more than a space, it's a second beginning for others and for me." Ellis nodded, his eyes warm. "Then I'm in. Whatever you need. I'll help." Julia felt tears press behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she offered him the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep, a place untouched by past hurt. The following month was a whirlwind. Between city meetings, fundraising events, and design deadlines, Julia barely slept. But she was alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Word began to spread about the project. Former clients donated. A local women's shelter offered to partner. Even her old college professor sent an email congratulating her on finally doing what you were meant to do. One afternoon, while finalizing construction permits, Julia received a letter at the loft. It was handwritten in blue ink, the return address familiar. Daniel. She debated opening it, but something inside her urged her to read it, not out of hope, but closure. She sat at her kitchen counter, unfolded the paper, and began to read. He wrote about how he had started therapy and was uncovering patterns he hadn't acknowledged. He apologized not just for Amber, but for the way he'd minimized her, ignored her dreams, and relied on her forgiveness like it was a given. He said he didn't expect anything but wanted her to know he saw it all now, and he wished her peace. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer next to a small tin of old love notes. She didn't tear it up. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. That evening, she stood inside the shell of the old library again, this time with Ellis and 2 volunteers. The sun filtered through the dirty windows, casting streaks of light across the dusty floors. Julia inhaled deeply, breathing impossibility. "We're going to need a name," Ellis said, kicking at a piece of broken tile. Julia looked around and smiled. "How about Sanctuary Studio? It fits," he said. "So do you." She turned to face him. The look in his eyes was steady, kind. There was something unspoken there, an invitation, not a demand. Julia didn't answer with words. She simply nodded, heart open, unafraid. That weekend, Julia hosted an open house at the theater to showcase the completed restoration. As she walked the grand hallway, guests gasped at the elegance, the precision, the soul of the design. She gave a short speech thanking the team, the city, and everyone who had believed in the vision. When the applause quieted, she added one final note. This space was once on the verge of being forgotten. But beauty doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone to believe in it again. And that's what we're doing. Not just with buildings, but with ourselves. We're choosing to begin again. Tears shimmered in the crowd. Julia stepped off the stage, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. She had built more than a project. She had built herself back one tile, one truth, one choice at a time, and the foundation had never been stronger. The grand opening of Sanctuary Studio came on a Sunday drenched in sunlight. The decommissioned library, now reborn as a haven of renewal, stood proudly in the heart of the East Side, its arched windows gleaming with fresh glass, its facade painted in warm earth, tones that welcomed you like an embrace. A banner hung across the entrance Sanctuary Studio, a space for healing, creation, and rebirth. Julia stood at the threshold in a soft gray jumpsuit, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back in a low bun. The volunteers bustled around her, arranging chairs, laying out refreshments, setting up the art displays created by the women in the pilot program. Each piece, some abstract, some painfully literal, told stories of survival, self-discovery, and new beginnings. As the morning light poured in through the skylights, it spilled across painted canvases and clay sculptures like a quiet blessing. She took a moment to breathe. to simply feel the space. The scent of lavender and cedar wood diffused through the room. Laughter bubbled up from a group of women helping each other pin name tags. Music floated through the speakers, gentle, hopeful, never too loud. This was it. This was the culmination of everything: the sleepless nights, the heartbreak, the rebuilding. And it wasn't just hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever sat in silence wondering if they were allowed to want more. A local news crew arrived to cover the event. Julia gave a brief interview explaining the mission of Sanctuary Studio. It's not just about art, she said, the sun hallowing her face. It's about restoring voices, about giving women a place to remember who they are outside of what they've survived. Every stroke of paint, every word written, every space held here, it's all part of that reclamation. Guests poured in: city council members, former clients, donors, strangers who had heard whispers of the space and came looking for something, maybe hope, maybe connection. Julia greeted them all with calm warmth, her eyes lit with purpose. At noon, the main ceremony began. A small stage had been set up in what used to be the reading hall, now transformed into a gathering space ringed with windows and potted plants. Aisha gave the opening remarks, sharing her own story of loss and finding sanctuary within herself. Then Julia took the mic. For a moment, she just looked around the room. 3 years ago, she began, I thought my life was ending. My marriage had unraveled. My sense of self was threadbare. I didn't know who I was without someone else to define me. But what I've learned, and what I hope this space proves, is that sometimes endings are just openings in disguise. Pain doesn't disqualify you from joy. In fact, it might just be the thing that leads you to it. She paused, letting that settle. This studio is for every woman who has ever been told she was too quiet, too emotional, too complicated, too much, or not enough. You are not too anything. You are exactly right, and you deserve space to heal, to grow, to create, to lead. Welcome to Sanctuary. Applause thundered through the hall. Some stood, some cried. All felt the gravity of what Julia had created, not just a studio, but a movement. Over the next hours, guests toured the space. They read poems written by survivors and taped to the walls. They watched short films made by women who had never touched a camera before Sanctuary. They added brushstrokes to a collaborative mural that began with a single phrase, I am still here. Ellis found Julia standing in the back, watching it all with a faraway look. You did it, he said. We did, she corrected gently, turning to him with a smile. He looked at her, a question behind his eyes. But he didn't ask it. He didn't need to. That night, after everyone had gone and the space had returned to a soft stillness, Julia walked barefoot across the hardwood floors. She turned off the main lights and stood beneath the central skylight. The moon glowed above her, casting pale silver onto the studio floor. She sat down on one of the floor cushions and opened her journal. Entry 1, the day after Sanctuary opened. I used to think healing was something you reached like a destination. Now I know it's a rhythm. Some days it's a drum beat, others it's barely a whisper. But it's always there if I'm still enough to hear it. I don't miss Daniel, not the real him and not the version I wanted him to be. I grieved what we had. Then I grieved what I had lost in myself. And now I am whole, not perfect, not finished, but whole. And I am home. Weeks passed and Sanctuary Studio became a fixture in the community. They held weekly workshops, ceramics on Mondays, journaling circles on Wednesdays, open mic nights every second Friday. Julia watched as women who had once arrived with downcast eyes now stood on stage reading their poetry. She saw laughter bloom where silence used to live. She saw the power of safe spaces. On a warm Friday afternoon, a woman came in holding the hand of a teenage girl. "She's my daughter," the woman said. "She hasn't spoken to me much since the divorce, but when she heard about this place, she asked if we could come." Julia knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "You're both welcome here, for as long as you need." The girl gave the faintest nod. That night, Julia cried in the shower not from sadness, but from the sheer enormity of what had become possible. One morning as she opened the studio, she noticed a small box on the doorstep. No name, just a ribbon and a card that read, "Thank you for choosing to stay soft in a world that tried to harden you." Inside was a necklace, a delicate silver pendant shaped like an open door. Julia pressed it to her heart. That weekend, she wore it as she spoke at a women's conference. Her talk was titled "Rebuilding with Grace." She shared stories of failure and forgiveness, of architecture and identity, of choosing presence over perfection. Her words landed like seeds, and long after the applause faded, women came up to hug her, to thank her, to whisper their own secrets and hopes. That night, Ellis walked her home. They didn't talk much, just walked side by side beneath the amber glow of streetlights. At her door, he turned to her. "There's no right time, I know that. But if ever you wanted to," Julia reached up and touched his hand. "I know. And that was enough. Not everything needs a bow. Not all stories end with a kiss. Sometimes the most profound endings are open, like a door, like a breath." And so Julia lived, fully, bravely, softly. The woman who had once folded herself to fit inside someone else's world was now building entire spaces from the ground up. And every time a woman walked into Sanctuary Studio and felt seen, felt safe, felt strong, Julia's legacy echoed softly in the walls. "You are not alone. You are not too much. You are not too late. You are just beginning."